Hello, welcome back to my channel and welcome to my 1930s wrap-up. I want to start off this video apologizing this is going up a little late because while I was editing the original video, half of my files ended up being corrupted, so I kind of have to start from scratch and re-record everything. So apologies about this being a little bit late, but we're gonna get through it now and cross our fingers that this one doesn't get corrupted. But if you're seeing it, it didn't get corrupted. So we started out the decade with 1931 and The Floating Admiral by various authors. Now, I had given a synopsis about what this is about, and I got it a little bit wrong, so we're gonna start by going over what the actual premise behind this book is. There are, I don't even remember how many authors, but one author per chapter. Every author, except for the authors that write chapters 1, 2, and the prologue, have to be able to tell you at the time that they write their chapter who the killer would be if they would have finished out the book for the rest of the book, right? They cannot introduce new complications to make the story more difficult. Like, the person who writes chapter 18 can't introduce a new character and decide that that character is the murderer. If they add extra clues to who done it, they have to be able to explain their own clues to the group after the whole book is written. So if you go back and read chapter 4 and then they're one of the other authors is what is this clue? The author who wrote chapter 4 has to be oh, this clue was supposed to lead me or lead the reader down this track, whether it's an actual clue or a distraction clue. And they have to be able to provide the ending to the story, which is in the appendix of this book, everybody's ending, and nothing supernatural can be added and nothing can happen at the end of the story that the clues didn't lead to, if that makes sense. You can say a clue is a false clue, but you can't say who done it with somebody who the clues never pointed towards that person in any way. So while it sounds like a really, really cool premise, the execution was very mediocre to me. There was a clear difference between the investigator's personality for every author writing the investigator. He would be really chill and really fun in one chapter, and then he would be a complete dick the next chapter, and then the next chapter he'd be really boring and serious, and it was just this is not the same person. What the F is going on? So there was no attempt by the authors to blend their writing styles with each other's writing styles. Absolutely no attempt. You could clearly tell that every single chapter was written by a completely different person. As for the ending, a lot of them had the same murderer as their end result, but the reasoning for the murder and the why was just vastly different across all of them. Not everybody did have the same murderer, but the majority came to the same conclusion. Spoilers on this part, but Agatha Christie's solution was by far the funniest. The niece character in this book was described as very ugly, and Agatha Christie just took that as she was a cross-dresser and she was a man the whole time. It was just one of those that's so far-fetched, but it's so amusing. Overall, I ended up giving this book 3 stars because I thought the premise was just awesome. Just the execution was very not well done. So, 3 stars. The next book that I read for 1932 was Brave New World by Aldus Huxley. I don't know why I just butchered his name. Aldous Huxley. This is a science fiction kind of post-apocalyptic type book where humanity is now like genetically engineered. There is no sex or like actual birth any longer. I guess there is sex. There's a lot of sex, but no one gets pregnant anymore. So you could have sex without any repercussions of getting pregnant. And everybody kind of like shares partners. There's no, what is the word I'm looking for? There's no monogamous relationships anymore. It's actually very frowned upon to have any sort of monogamous relationship. You're considered selfish and weird. So the embryos are genetically engineered to fit the social level that they are raised for. And you will get a factory that is full of like duplicates. So you'll have like one male and one female in the factory, and then literally everybody in the entire factory looks like identical twins. And they're even genetically and socially engineered as children to be happy and be accepting of their role in life. Like they were specifically bred to do what they're doing, and because you were bred and then later like trained for it, you are kind of designated to be, or like there's no reason that you should be happy. There's no reason you shouldn't be happy, and they kind of like programmed any sort of unhappiness out of a person, either genetically or how they're raised as children. And parents, because like these people are all genetically engineered, there's no parents raising children. It's like factories of scientists raise the children with like social manipulation and stuff like that. A lot of the science in this book has been proven wrong since the 1930s, like things that just won't actually ever work the way that it's described in this book. But at the time, these were kind of like ideas. The characters that we follow are all like the highest tier. So there's no like duplicates or twins. They're all like just themselves with their own personalities. They think more. They kind of act like rich people do now, where they're just better than everybody and they know it, and they're supposed to be because that's how they were genetically designed. There's just no, but it's all individuals. There's no like mass duplicates. They also take a drug called soma that is kind of designed, I want to say like heroin or opium, to keep people happy. So if you do well at work, you just pop your little pill and you get drunk without the alcohol next day side effects. And that's another way, like if the training doesn't work to keep you happy, then the drugs will keep you happy. So two of the highest class people named Bernard and Lenina, I don't know, Lenina, Lenina, I'm gonna say Lenina, are going on vacation to a savage reservation. And this is a reservation where people, or this is a reservation in like Mexico to like southern United States, where the people on the land live as Navajo tribes. And they are not genetically engineered. They have no jobs or anything like that other than just the normal family unit, and they don't know anything about technology outside of the reservation. It's basically there for like a study purpose. And in the savage reservation, they find a child who was a child born to two of the genetically engineered people, and the woman was thought dead and abandoned in the reservation. She'd gotten pregnant and she should have been able to go back home and take a pill to negate that pregnancy, but she fell off a cliff or fell into a ravine or something, and no one could find her, and everybody just assumed she was dead. But she ended up getting pregnant and having a kid, and then ended up living in this reservation even though she should have never been there. So she's still there and she has a son, and they end up taking that son back with them to society and how he should have been raised. even though he should have really never been born based on the other society's rules. And then the rest of the book is kind of going through this guy's, I can't remember his name, John or the Savage is what they call him. It's going through like John's life and his, like, him coming into this world as somebody who was raised in a world like our own today, where we still have family units and not everybody is bred specifically for a role in life. The horror, because a lot of these utopian science fictions have like a horror or a sacrifice that is needed in order to create the utopia. This one is the sacrifice for art to advance science, and you see that throughout the book. And then there is the question is, because everybody kind of like lives on the same plane of happiness their entire life, is it possible for anybody to really experience happiness without being able to experience misery? Overall, I really, really like this book. I gave it 4 stars, and I highly recommend it to people who are interested in classic science fiction, or specifically classic dystopia type novels. For 1933, I was originally going to read The Shape of Things to Come by H.G. Wells, but that was the worst book ever, and I DNF'd it about chapter 2 because I honestly kept falling asleep while reading it, and that's not really what you want to do while reading a 500-page book, is fall asleep every chapter. So I ended up replacing that with The Werewolf of Paris by Guy Endore. And the entire book is a metaphor for civilization versus the inner beast. Very, very similar vein to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, except for the fact that this is far, far more violent and graphic. There are trigger warnings in this book for everything you could possibly think of. Now, this is written in the 1930s, so there are no like graphic descriptions, but you know that these things are happening. Now, this is about a young man named Bertrand, and he is the child of a cursed line, but he doesn't really know that he's the child of a cursed line growing up. He is a Percival, and the Percivals were cursed to become werewolves because they were part of like a warring Hatfields and McCoys type family, and one of the men in their line was kept in a cage and treated like a dog for his entire life. And like, when I say entire life, I mean like he was captured at 20 and he wasn't released from his cage until he was in his 70s, and then was given back to his family. And it was a lightless cage, and he was only fed like raw meat twice a week and legitimately treated like a dog. He would only be fed when he started howling like a dog. And this somehow created a curse where he became a dog, or more specifically, a werewolf. Bertrand was the result of sexual assault. His father was a priest who raped a young girl. I think she was like 13, which, yikes. But like I said, it was written in the 30s, so there's no detail on it. He basically becomes a wolf when he sleeps at night, and you don't actually get a description of the transformation. And there is a very big question in the book, is like he actually transforming into a wolf, because people keep seeing a wolf and they don't actually see him doing it, or is this his inner beast, and is he just behaving like this because of some weird genetic curse, and not actually transforming, because no one actually ever sees him transform, and he falls asleep and becomes a wolf. He desecrates graves, he kills prostitutes, he just kills people. He disfigures a lot of prostitutes. He starts paying women to like rip them apart in a sexual act, and he can find people who were willing to do that. That's part of his cure. And then this takes place in the mix of the French-Prussian War, because it's a kid's lifetime. So French-Prussian War, then into the Third Republic up until the Paris Commune, which is just a bunch of civil wars and stuff within Paris. And he kind of goes through all of this, and it's kind of a commentary alongside like the inner beast of man versus that war and conflict bring out this inner beast in all of humanity, and they're not all just like this kid. Even though this book was really dark, like really dark, I super enjoyed the story and how Guy Endore like created this question of man versus beast, and I ended up giving it a 4-star. So next up, in 1934, we have Why Didn't They Ask Evans by Agatha Christie. And this is a very Scooby-Doo fun type of whodunit mystery with amateur detectives. 2 kids who team up and figure out who done it. And I can't really give you a whole lot of background on the story without ruining the story, because it is like just a mystery. It's a whodunit mystery. So I'm gonna give like the kind of a little bit of an overview. A man has been found and he fell off a cliff. He was dying because when he fell off the cliff he broke his back, and the last words that he said were, "Why didn't they ask Evans?" And then 2 young people, it's late teens, early 20s, basically are like, that's a really weird thing for him to say as his last words. Let's go figure out who's Evans. Maybe he didn't fall off the cliff and maybe he was pushed. And that's kind of what the whole story was about. It was fine, maybe just not my type of story, because fun Scooby-Doo mysteries just really aren't my thing. I gave it 3 stars because I thought it was cute, but I didn't love it. 1935, I read A Little House on the Prairie by Laura Ingalls Wilder, and this is based off of her actual life. There's an entire series about it where her dad apparently hates society, and they will go to like a remote place, build a house from nothing. Then other people start moving in, and her dad's like, screw this, I hate people. They pack everything into a covered wagon and then just go further west. And this is the 3rd book in the Little House series, and it's really the most popular one. Now, they are coming from, I want to say, Ohio? Iowa? Somewhere in the Appalachians, I would say. It says in the beginning, I just honestly don't remember. And they end up in Kansas. They're near Independence, Missouri, which is on the Kansas-Missouri border, but I think they actually end up in Kansas because it's in a prairie, and Kansas is mostly prairie land. So you can roughly date this book because at the beginning of the book, Laura's having a conversation with her mother where her mother says that the government is talking about giving away tribal land for people who want to get free land and claim land in the Midwest, which puts it, the Oklahoma Land Run, in 1889. So I'm assuming this is somewhere in the 1880s, but there's no actual like date on it. And basically the entire book is them getting in a covered wagon, going west, finding a spot that they want to settle in, and just what happens from clearing the land, building the house, getting food, meeting neighbors. Just a literal year in the life of a homesteader. And just literally surviving off the land and your own abilities with absolutely no help from anybody else at all. This is a children's book, and I personally would 100% not recommend it for your children because there is very heavy casual racism towards Native Americans. There is a lot of racial slurs for Native Americans, talks of ownership. Laura at one point asked her mom if she can have an Indian baby. She's just like, Mom, I want one as a pet. I'm going to go take it from this Indian lady and keep it. And it's just like, you can't. And her mom's like, no, honey, they don't make good pets or something along those lines. And you're like, you can't say this about other human beings. So just because of the racial differences between the 19th century and the 21st century, I would definitely not recommend you actually have your children read this, just due to the way that they treat an entire race of people in a really, really negative light. And the way that she addresses it, like, this is completely acceptable to use these racial slurs towards Native Americans because they're subhuman. I ended up giving this 2 stars just because the story was kind of mediocre to me to begin with, and then the racial slurs did not help me enjoy the book at all. Next up, for 1936, I read Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell, and this is a classic that also addresses racism, but in a completely different way. Now, this takes place during, like, before, during, and after the American Civil War in Georgia. It goes from the plantation of Tara, which is Scarlett's home, Scarlett's the main character, to Atlanta and back and forth. Tara is somewhere near Jonesboro. If you know the state of Georgia at all, you can get like a general feel for where the location is. And there's obviously going to be a lot of racism towards Black people, but it approaches it in a very, very different way than we see in the Civil Rights Movement, where while African Americans during the Civil War were slaves, and no one needs to be told that slavery is wrong, a lot of the Black characters in this book are treated like family members. And even after they are free, they choose to stay with the white families and live in poverty with the white families. So while you have, there's obviously people who are horrible, horrible slave owners and they beat the shit out of their slaves, but this kind of shows a different type of slave owner, where the only people who are hateful and racist towards Black people like we see today, where they treat African Americans or people of color with hate, distrust, and fear, that is only seen in this book from the Yankees once they come and take over Georgia or Atlanta after the Civil War. The Southerners do not at all treat African Americans with fear. There's hate, but not the fear. And it's, even though you know going into this that slavery is wrong and this should have never existed, but it did, and having this historical look woven in with a romance is a really, really cool way to do this. Now, Scarlett O'Hara is the main character, and you kind of have a love triangle type thing going on where she is 17 at the beginning of the book, and all she wants is for all the boys to love her. That's her one goal in life, is for every man to be head over heels in love with her, and she needs to be the most popular woman in existence. So she decides that she's in love with this guy named Ashley, but Ashley is set to announce that he is getting engaged to his cousin Melanie. And Scarlett's like, no, I'm going to break up this marriage and he's going to be with me. And it doesn't turn out in Scarlett's favor, and Ashley doesn't choose her over Melanie, which kind of creates this obsession on Scarlett's end because she has been rejected. And the other main love interest in this book is Rhett Butler, who overhears Scarlett professing her love to Ashley, and Ashley turning her down. So Scarlett and Rhett ended up being a lot like each other personality-wise, and all of the characters go in and out of meeting each other, and this spans like a lot of years, probably a good 20, if not more, years. And we see Scarlett kind of grow up and change and want different goals in her life as she gets out of her teens and suffers through the war and goes through loss. She loses 2 husbands and multiple family members, multiple friends, and her entire world changes. And her character development is one of the most well done character developments I have ever seen. And she's just one of those characters that you love to hate, where you're just like, girl, what the F is wrong with you? But then you still want to read on and watch her do all of these stupid things that sometimes turn out really great and sometimes not so much. I love Scarlett and Rhett's characters. I hate Ashley as a character, but I think he's supposed to be a hateable character. And one of the things throughout the book is the reader is supposed to be like, Scarlett, you're so smart about so many things. Why can you not see that this guy is just not at all what you should be going for here? And the frustration of the reader going through that. This is a long book. Like, it's stupid long. It is like over 1,000 pages. So, but if you're good with tomes, I highly, highly, highly recommend reading this. I gave it 4 stars. Next up for 1937 was Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. This one is an interesting read. It reads like a contemporary, though I don't think contemporaries were invented till, or the contemporary genre wasn't invented till, I want to say 1960s maybe? Definitely not in the 30s. If you want to read a classic from the perspective of a Black woman in the 1930s, I highly recommend you read this, especially if you like contemporary. It's told, there's some like plot holes in it. First off, the story is supposed to be told from the perspective of Janie, and Janie has been away from her home for many years, and she comes back, meets up with her best friend, and sits on the porch with her best friend. And this book is like basically her telling her life story to her best friend. Like, this is what happened the past 10 years, but before that, before I could tell you what happened while I was gone, I kind of need to give you a background on my whole life. But during the book, there are parts of the story that happen that Janie would actually never be able, she would have never known about. Like, they're from other people's perspectives, and there's no way Janie would have been able to tell her best friend these things because Janie was never privy to these conversations. So Janie, obviously, like I said, is the main character. Her grandmother was a slave who, at right before the Civil War started, gave birth to Janie's mother, who was the product of the slave owner raping her. And he was in love with her, but you can't really have consensual relationship when one of the people in the relationship is a slave. So it's kind of automatically rape, no matter if they say it was consensual. He loved Janie's grandmother, but he had to leave for the war, and then Janie's grandmother had to run because the slave owner's wife was going to kill her and the baby. Then Janie's mother ended up being raped by her school teacher when she was 16 or 17. He had kidnapped her when she was walking home and held her in the woods and just brutally sexually assaulted her for multiple days before she managed to escape. And Janie was the result of this. So Janie's grandmother, having gone through generations of sexual assault, was very, very concerned for Janie not flirting with men. And then as soon as she was of age, she wanted to get her married to a respectable man. And the story is kind of like, Janie's grandmother is like, there's no such thing as love. You just need to be supported. You need security, financial security. And Janie wants love. And it's kind of her story of going into this loveless marriage and then, but never getting a chance to date or be a teenager, and then running away from the loveless marriage, getting into bad situations before finally growing up and coming into her own as a powerful, self-supporting Black woman, which her grandmother thought would never, ever be able to happen. I gave this 3 stars because while I feel this is a very important story, I don't like contemporary, and her telling the story but knowing things that she should have never known like threw me off a lot. So I still recommend reading this. It's just not going to be like the most literary thing. It's just an important story to read POC classics. And this is a very easy, good one to read. Next up for 1938 was The Sword and the Stone by T.H. White. I had a lot of problems with this book. It was boring. You would think that The Sword and the Stone, if you've seen the movie, the Disney movie, that it wouldn't be boring, but this was really, really boring. I really don't like how T.H. White writes. He has this weird writing style where he writes like he's writing to a small child, where there's a lot of list and a lot of repetitiveness, kind of like The Wizard of Oz, where it's like Dorothy would do something and then the Tin Man would do something and then the Lion would do something, which is age appropriate for a book like that. But the vocabulary in The Sword of the Stone is so advanced that the way that he is telling the story with the list and the repetitiveness is not appropriate for the vocabulary level, because there's no way that somebody who needs a story spelled out for them in that way has the vocabulary to read this story. There was not even any vague attempt to be historically accurate at this, and he introduces parts of the story as fact when it has no fact at all behind it. And he doesn't write in a way where a child reading this book would know that these things aren't true. They're going to take what he presents as facts or history at face value because he writes them like they're actually true accounts from this time. And you're just teaching children incorrect things for no fucking reason whatsoever. And because this is a children's book, that really pissed me off. One of the examples of his repetitiveness is a wizard's duel that you may remember from the movie, where Merlin is fighting Madame Mim. And he explains what a wizard's duel is over a few pages, including like a brief history of wizard's duels. Then he uses a bunch of similes for modern examples of a wizard duel, even though you completely understood reading the first section what a wizard duel was. And then the actual wizard's duel happened. So you get that same thing 3 times over, and it's just like, I don't fucking care. Just get to the point. The overall idea of the book is fine. Its author is learning lessons on how to be a good king. Merlin lives his life in reverse, so he's already experienced Arthur as an adult, so he is teaching him what he needs to know as an adult, as a child, to make sure that Arthur is a good person. It's very confusing. And he learns from people as well as animals. Like I said, the overall story is basically the same as the Disney movie. So if you were interested in this story, I highly recommend you just go watch the Disney movie. On top of all of the annoying problems in this book, there is racism and there is a lot of extreme animal cruelty. So I give this a 2 stars that leans more towards a 1 star, and I definitely recommend that you just stick to the Disney movie with this one. Next up for 1939 is The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. Now, this took place in the 1930s in Oklahoma during the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. Actually, it took place in Oklahoma and California, but it starts in Oklahoma. And before I kind of get into the story, I want to give a little bit of background on one of the multiple reasons that the Dust Bowl happened. So in the late 19th century, Oklahoma was open up for homesteaders, and people would just do a land run, claim a plot of land, and then start farming it. And you start out with getting enough for yourself, farming a homestead to support you and your family, and then eventually you're going to want to start making money off of your land. And one of the most profitable crops is cotton, but cotton has a downside in it just horribly strips the land of nutrients. So how you typically grow cotton is you will split your land into halves or thirds or however, and then you grow cotton on part of it while you let the rest of it just fallow, like empty, nothing on it, nothing growing for a year season, or more potentially, allowing the rainfall to put the nutrients back in the ground, and then you switch every year. Well, first off, this works in places like Georgia because Georgia gets a whole lot of rainfall compared to Oklahoma, so you have to let land in Oklahoma set longer than you would in places where there's a lot of rainfall because it needs a certain amount of rainfall to replenish the nutrients in the ground. So that's one of the struggles of growing cotton in Oklahoma. Another thing is the price of cotton will fluctuate, and as people kept having to grow, they would need more money. Maybe a couple of years, probably I would say during World War I or prior to World War I, when everybody's in an economic crisis, the landowners or the farmers would have to borrow money to keep growing. And then the next year, not only do you have to have enough money to support or to grow crops for the next year, you have to pay the bank back as well. And then you run into, you need more money, and the only way to get more money is to grow more crops, make more money. So maybe you normally do half of your, or 1/3 of your fields have cotton every year, and you let the other 2/3 stay fallow. So now you have to do half and half. And then you keep owing the bank more money, so you do less and less and less that has to set, which means, or less and less and less of your land is allowed to set, which means there's less nutrients, so you get weaker cotton crops every year. And it just is like a downhill battle. Then you had the 1929 where the stock market crashes and banks are demanding that farmers pay them their money back now. So you're having to farm these entire fields and not let them set fallow at all. They can't regain any of their nutrients. And then it doesn't rain. You've got a drought. And the clay is so weak and so nutrient sapped that it just turns into dust when it dries instead of dirt. And the dust gets in the air from the wind, because there's a whole hell of a lot of wind in Oklahoma, and you get a great bowl of dust over the entire state during the drought season, because the nutrients of the soil are just so sapped from all of the cotton. And that's basically how the Dust Bowl happened. This starts at the beginning of the Dust Bowl, and it's after World War I, but before World War II, so tractors have been invented, but individual farmers can't really afford tractors. They still do everything by hand, but all of these individual farmers are losing their land to the banks because they just can't pay back their loans because no one has any money at all. So the banks, trying to make any money at all, are kicking the sharecroppers and the farmers off of their land, saying, this is ours now, you have to get off. And then they hire one farmer out of maybe like 20, 30, 50 families can take a mechanical tractor and then just plow the major fields all by himself and just give everything to the bank, and then the bank pays him $3 a day or whatever. I think it was $3 a day in the book, which is a lot cheaper than having all of these people living on the land. Just paying one family to live on the land instead of paying 20 is going to, in the end, be a lot cheaper. And even if the cotton crop is weak, there's just so much of it that it doesn't really matter. So all these families are being displaced off of their farms, including the Joads, who are the main characters. And it starts out with one of the sons coming back from McAllister. And for those of you who don't know anything about Oklahoma, which is probably most of you, McAllister is a prison. I grew up in Oklahoma. My grandparents lived through the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. So a lot of this stuff I am familiar with when I understand most people wouldn't be. But he had just got out of prison for killing a man, and he's going home and he finds his family packing up to leave because the bank has kicked them off their farm. And it's kind of like a, where are we going to go? Well, there's been flyers going around that saying workers are needed in California. So all of these families are selling off most of their belongings, selling off their horse and buggy, and they're buying a crap car, and because that's the only thing they can afford, and then heading to California to work, because the flyers say that there's 800 workers needed in California. Turns out, yeah, there's 800 workers needed in California, but there's 200,000 people who are broke and homeless heading to California to take these 800 jobs. And this is basically like watching these poor farmers get fucked over completely by every businessman and capitalism in general. And no matter how hard they work, they're just not getting anything because no one is giving them a chance. And that's basically the entire story. It's super depressing, and without spoiling anything, that was one of the most fucked up endings I've ever read in my entire life, and it came out of left field and I did not expect it at all. I ended up really, really liking this book and enjoying it because, you know me, I love books that are super depressing, and I ended up giving it a 4 stars. Now, the final book for 1940 that I read was For Whom the Bell Tolls by Ernest Hemingway. And I've read Hemingway in college and didn't like him, but a lot of the reviews on this book were saying that I love Hemingway and this is just, I hate this book. Like, this is bad Hemingway. And I was like, great. Because I hate Hemingway, so I'll probably like bad Hemingway. No. No, I was lying to myself. Bad Hemingway is just worse for me than regular Hemingway. This is supposedly a book about the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s in Spain. And your main character is a guy named Robert Jordan. And if you're like, Robert Jordan, that sounds really familiar. Well, see, there's this fantasy writer named Robert Jordan, except for this is a pen name, and my bet's on that he really liked this book by Ernest Hemingway and took his pen name from the main character in For Whom the Bell Tolls. Sorry, slide tangent. Anyway, this is supposed to be about the Spanish Civil War, and Robert Jordan is a young American man, I would say, late 20s, early 30s American man from Montana. He's a teacher, and he goes to fight for the resistance in the Spanish Civil War. And it's basically poor people in the resistance overthrowing rich people in a fascist regime. So it's Robert Jordan. He's been there for a while, and he's a demolitions expert. And at the beginning of this 500-page book, he is sent to meet up with some guerrilla fighters in the mountains of Spain and to blow up a bridge. And this is written like this is one step in like multiple different stories. Like, this is like the first battle you're gonna see, and then you're gonna get a lot more battles because it's a war book. So to me, a war book is either about like the struggles, like mental struggles of war, or like actual battles. Well, I have a physical copy of the book right here, and if you see this tab that I have right here, I don't know if you can see that at all. I don't have my glasses on, so I actually can't see my viewfinder. But this is where they blow up the bridge. So this is not a story about war. There are a grand total of 2 battles in a 500-page book about a civil war. And one of them's not even a real battle. So boring is a word that I would definitely use to describe this. This is written in English because Hemingway wrote, speaks, knows, he's an English person. That was way harder to say than it should have been. This is written in English, but in a way that it's supposed to read like it's been translated from Spanish. So there is a lot of switching between the word you and thee, and the word your and like thy. Because if you know anything about the Spanish language, there's like a semi-formal and a formal, and I guess Hemingway thought the best way to address like a formal way of speech was to use thee and thy instead of you and your. That didn't really bother me, but I could see it bothering some people. What did bother me was the love interest character in here. Her name is Maria, and I have never in my entire life hoped that a character died so much. She was so annoying. She's one of those people who every conversation with her and Robert, she's just like, do you love me? Do you think I'm pretty? Are you lying to me? You don't really think I'm pretty. Tell me I'm pretty. Tell me you love me. And I'm just like, oh my God, bitch, shut up. And it's like, even like when they're in danger, she's like, I'm gonna come with you. And he's like, go back to camp. Like, we have to flee. You've got to go pack up all of our belongings while I go make sure that no one sneaks up on us. And she's like, no, I'm gonna come with you. And she like puts her hand in his pocket. She's like, I'll go back to camp if you tell me you love me. And I'm just like, so annoying. I have no idea. Like, the main part of the story is this love story, and I do not see what any human being could have ever seen in this woman. Ever. I hated her so much. Another thing that really bothers me about this book is Hemingway has a way of writing to make the reader not be able to care about any horrible things that happen to their characters. It's one of the most amazing things that I've ever seen, where he can write about people getting like gang raped, murdered, tortured, and I have no emotional attachment to the events that he is writing about. And I've never experienced that with another author. It is amazing, but it also does not make for good reading. You want to have emotional attachment to your characters, and I honestly cared more about Maria being a horribly annoying person than I did about her being kidnapped and sold into like sexual slavery. And it wasn't anything more like, normally I wouldn't be affected like that. I'm usually very affected and like cry my eyes out whenever I read about stuff like that. So it is entirely Hemingway's way of writing and not any flaw within me, which is amazing that he can write that horribly, or write such horrible things without causing any sort of feeling or emotion in the reader. But it's also boring. And it's 500 pages of them in the mountains doing fuck all nothing, waiting to blow up this bridge, and Robert and Maria banging, and Maria being annoying. There's also a lot of like, the characters will tell like stories of their past. That's what makes it, most of it, to be fair. I just don't care. And I hated this book, and I don't ever want to read anything by Hemingway again. I gave this 2 stars because there wasn't anything problematic with it. I just didn't like it. 1 stars are reserved for like severely problematic stuff and stuff that no one should ever read. I'm sure I know actually there's tons of people who like this book. It's just not for me. So that is my 1930s wrap up, even if it ended on a little rant there. Sorry about that. I will see you in the next video.